What are the most common if you know what most common triggers for type 1 diabetes are, that could explain its growing prevalence? Is it mostly from birth? Is it mostly likely drug induced at a later age? Has the main causes changed from a few decades ago till now? I know we've talked a lot about this, but
yeah. Okay. This is a phenomenal question. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune version of diabetes. There's only two autoimmune versions. It's called type 1 and 1.5. 1.5 is basically a slow onset version of type 1 that happens to adults over the age of 30. But type 1 is generally what affects, young kids, adolescents, anyone under the age of 30. Okay. So historically speaking, if you look at the scientific data to try and figure out what percentage of the population is diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and how does that change over the course of time, what you'll find is that there isn't very much variation from as much as like 50 years ago until the early 2000s. So for about 50 years, the percentage of the population that was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes remained relatively constant. What ended up happening somewhere around 2005 or so, about 15 years ago, was there was a significant increase in the prevalence of type 1 diabetes, and it started to increase in both prevalence and incidence. And researchers were like, how's that possible? That's not supposed to happen, right? If it was just purely a genetic condition that had no environmental influences, then it should still affect the same proportion of the population at all times. But because it was increasing, they were like, wait a minute, hold on a second. Yes, it has a genetic component, but maybe there's something else in the environment that could be triggering this, right? So there's been a lot of research to try and figure out, well, what is causing this 23% increase in the last decade? That's a big increase, right? Yeah. So there's three different lines of thought. Number one, the consumption of cow's milk protein at a very young age. Okay, cow's milk protein, specifically the casein molecule, has been implicated in a number of different disease processes. The China study wrote all about casein. Dr. Colin Campbell wrote about the fact that animals that were fed with casein showed a greater risk for the development of cancer inside of their liver and many other tissues. That research has actually been heavily criticized, which is unfortunate, but he actually has shown multiple times over that adding casein and subtracting casein, you can literally flip on and off the cancer switch by turning it on, turning it off, turning it on, turning it off. And the data, from my perspective, looked like it was relatively well done. Okay?
Yeah. Why do people dispute that so much? I mean, do they just say, oh, it's because it's a mouse study, it doesn't count? I mean, he was able to, replicate it again and again and again, literally turn up casein protein, right? And you watch cancer skyrocket. Turn it down, cancer basically goes away. And you can repeat that again. And that's the only thing that they change. Casein up, casein down, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how do they dispute that study in any way?
That's a great question. To be perfectly honest, I stopped listening to the arguments because there were a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? There were a lot of armchair scientists who were trying to pretend like they knew what they were talking about, trying to give their opinion and citing a whole bunch of different stuff that just kind of became nonsensical at a certain point. The primary argument, like you said, is these studies weren't done in human beings, therefore they're not valid. The results don't translate over to human beings, which is not necessarily a true statement. In some situations, yes, the disease processes that initiate the tumor development or tumor progression are different in laboratory rodents than they are in human beings. They're different in rodents than they are in monkeys. There's no question about it. But the overwhelming majority of disease processes are actually conserved between rodents and human beings. And most people don't recognize this. So when I did my PhD, we did a lot of animal studies in mice and rats. And that was because we didn't have human use authorization. We didn't have a human use protocol in place. So we had to do it on laboratory animals. And the research that I investigated, the actual studies that I performed, I used the methodology that was used was developed in laboratory animals, but literally the exact same conditions that we put animals, that we exposed animals to, that created insulin resistance and diabetes, are verbatim the exact same nutrients that we exposed human beings to, or that research has exposed human beings to, that increases their chronic disease risk as well. So my point here is that you can sit here and debate whether or not a mouse study translates to a human all day long, but I think that it's a relatively weak argument, to be perfectly honest. Having done research myself and having spent a lot of time in this world, but beyond that, so basically we got casein that comes from animal protein, that comes specifically from dairy products, that can increase your risk for type 1 diabetes development. There's actually studies that take two twins that have the same genetic makeup. Both twins have type 1 diabetes. You feed one a high casein diet, you feed one a low casein diet, and their disease pathology completely changes. Their insulin requirements completely change, and what happens to them over the course of time completely changes. So it's a fascinating line of biology. Number 2, there's a virus. The virus is called the Coxsackie virus. The Coxsackie virus is a virus that can, when you are infected with it, can trigger the autoimmune process that can lead to type 1 diabetes and beta cell destruction, which limits your insulin production. Okay, so the Coxsackie virus is something that you don't necessarily present any symptoms to, but there have been a lot of people that I've spoken with who have type 1 diabetes who are like, oh yeah, my son had some ridiculous virus that I can't name it, I don't know exactly what it was, and then boom, 2 weeks later, all of a sudden type 1 diabetes set in, right? I've heard this story hundreds of times, and there is definitely a connection between either the Coxsackie virus or any derivative thereof and the increased risk for type 1 diabetes. The third one is one that we wrote about in the Mastering Diabetes book, which is actually a fascinating story. It's called molecular mimicry. Okay, molecular mimicry is the overall process that can lead to beta cell destruction. And there's a particular pathogen called MAP, Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. Don't remember that. Okay, MAP. MAP is a mycobacterium. Basically, it's a bacteria that looks like a fungi. And this bacteria can infect the digestive tract of cows that are in industrialized farms. Okay, usually cows that are in industrialized farms that are greater than 500 cows per farm. So you got hundreds, if not thousands, of cows that are all occupying a very small space. And if one of these cows ends up developing the MAP bacteria or harboring the MAP bacteria inside of its digestive tract, it develops a condition called Johne's disease. And Johne's disease actually causes muscle wasting and death in these cows. So if one cow ends up with the MAP bacteria, which is actually very common, then that one cow, when it poops, the fecal material on the ground ends up having live MAP bacteria. And that MAP bacteria actually gets onto the hooves and the skin of other animals that are nearby, and then it ends up passing from one animal to the next. Now, when you take that animal and you bring it into the slaughterhouse, it comes to the slaughterhouse and the MAP bacteria is actually present not only in the sick animal, but also on the exterior of other animals. The workers get it on their gloves, they get it on their outfit, they get it on their boots. And the MAP bacteria actually ends up getting packed inside of the meat that comes out of the slaughterhouse. And then when the meat actually goes in preparation to the grocery store, there is live MAP bacteria on the meat itself.
Interesting.
Even in milk products that have to be pasteurized, a small proportion of that MAP bacteria can actually escape pasteurization, and you end up with live MAP inside of milk products as well. Were you going to say something?
No, I just said that was, very interesting.
Yeah, it's not a very pleasant subject, to be perfectly honest. Now, what the heck is MAP bacteria? So MAP is present, let's put it this way, 100% of people who are enrolled in this one particular study that I read, who are living with type 1 diabetes, test positive for MAP bacteria inside of their digestive tract.
Have you ever tested yourself for it?
I never have, actually. I don't know how to get this test taken.
That'd be really interesting. Yeah, I wonder if you could somehow get that test.
Yeah, I would love to learn, actually, if that happened to me. But point being is that when exposed to MAP bacteria, that can increase your risk for the development of autoimmunity, especially type 1 diabetes. And then the other one is in humans is Crohn's disease.
Yeah.
Okay. So point being, in humans, in people with type 1 diabetes, the association is extremely strong. Whether it's 100% or 90% or 80%, it doesn't really matter. All that matters is that exposure to MAP that comes from livestock farms can present a serious risk and increase your risk for autoimmunity. So it's unfortunate, but the food system in which we operate today is very problematic for 1,000 different reasons. And this is yet another reason why avoiding animal products is going to put you in a position of power.